The morning Darcy first saw Alistair again, she almost dropped a tray of medication cups. It was her third week at Vancouver General, cardiology unit, 6th floor. She had finally stopped getting lost on the way to the supply room. She had finally learned which elevator was fastest and which one stalled between floors 2 and 3. She had finally begun to feel, cautiously, that she belonged there, and then he walked into morning rounds and dismantled all of it. He came in the way the new attendings always did. A little early, chart in hand, nodding to the charge nurse first, which was a good sign, because the ones who nodded to the charge nurse first were the ones who understood how hospitals actually worked. He had the same posture she remembered, taller than she'd always pictured in her memory, but then she'd been 17 the last time she saw him, and adults have a way of shrinking in the imagination until you're standing in the same room as them again. His hair was shorter. There were small lines near his eyes that hadn't been there before. Otherwise, he was exactly himself. And Darcy stood very still at the nursing station and told her heart to settle down. He went down the line of residents and nurses, shaking hands, learning names. Darcy watched his face the whole time. She was looking for the moment he would see her. The small pause, the catch, something. He reached her. He extended his hand. He said, "I don't think we've met yet." "Alistair Crane, welcome to the unit." His voice was identical to how she remembered it, careful and measured, with just that faint maritime edge that had never quite smoothed over. She said her name. He nodded. He moved on. For the rest of the morning, she could not concentrate on a single thing. Darcy grew up in a house on Nanaimo Street in East Vancouver, the kind of neighborhood that had been working class for so long it had started to believe that was its personality. The house belonged to her grandmother, Gran Bet, who had lived there since before Darcy's mother Catherine was born. Catherine had grown up in it and moved out and come back when Darcy's father left, which happened 2 weeks before Darcy's 6th birthday, and was handled, as far as Darcy could tell, by her mother crying quietly in the shower for approximately 3 months, and then never discussing it again. Catherine worked at a dental office on Hastings and picked up weekend shifts at a grocery store on Commercial. She was meticulous about money and generous, in ways that never looked like generosity. She always framed it as practicality. The extra blanket on Darcy's bed in winter was not because she worried about the heating bill. It was because wool retains warmth more efficiently than polyester. The packed lunches that were always bigger than necessary were not because she was feeding a child's loneliness with food. It was because children Darcy's age were nutritionally deficient as a demographic, and someone had to address it. Gran Bet saw through all of it. She always did. The house had a basement suite with a separate entrance, and Gran had always rented it to university students because she said they were better tenants than anyone gave them credit for. They were quiet because they studied. They were careful because they couldn't afford damage deposits twice. When Darcy was 14, the suite opened up again, and Gran placed a small card on the notice board at UBC. Alistair arrived on a Tuesday afternoon in September with 2 bags, a box of books, and a very serious expression. He was 20, a first-year medical student from Halifax, and he had the kind of quiet that felt settled rather than shy. Gran made him tea and asked him questions. He answered everything directly. He swept the front walk the next morning without being asked. He never left dishes in the sink. He introduced himself to Darcy on the second day as though she were a person worth introducing himself to, which she noticed. For the first month, she treated him the way she treated all of Gran's tenants, with polite indifference. He was background. He was rent income. He was the reason the basement bathroom had to be cleaned more often. The thing that changed everything was her science grade, specifically the 72 on her midterm that Catherine found in the kitchen, set down on the counter without comment, and did not bring up again, which somehow made it worse than if she'd said something. Gran was the one who finally sat across from Darcy at the kitchen table and said, "Alistair is studying medicine. He knows science. You need science. This seems like an obvious solution." Darcy protested at length. She was not a child. She did not need a tutor. She was fine. The 72 was a fluke. Gran looked at her the way she always did when Darcy was wrong about something. Then she went downstairs. Alistair came up that evening with a cup of tea and a completely neutral expression, sat down across from her, and looked at her midterm for exactly 1 minute without saying anything. Then he said, "Which part are you confused about?" She said she wasn't confused about anything. He tapped the page. She glared at him. He waited. She told him grudgingly which part she was confused about. They worked for 2 hours. He never once made her feel stupid. When she got something right, he moved on without celebration. which was better than praise because it meant the getting it right was simply expected. She found she wanted to live up to that expectation. She called him old man because she was 14 and the age gap seemed enormous and she needed some way to maintain the upper hand. He called her kid and looked completely unbothered by her tactics, which infuriated her. He would tap her lightly on the top of her head with 2 fingers when she lost focus. She stepped on his foot once, deliberately, when he'd been insufferably calm about a problem she'd gotten wrong 4 times. He yelped. She felt satisfied. He started keeping his feet tucked under his chair. Over time, the session stretched. Chemistry became physics, became calculus, became whatever she happened to be struggling with that week. Her mother began leaving a plate of food for him when the sessions ran through dinner, initially with the excuse that they had made too much, and then without the excuse because it had stopped needing one. Alistair helped her dad. Robert, her mother's quiet, steady partner, who arrived in Darcy's life when she was 12, and who she had decided to accept, carefully, the way you accept something good that you don't entirely trust yet. Carry lumber for the back deck one Saturday, without being asked, just because the stack was clearly too heavy for one person. Gran said plainly that he was a good young man, and Gran was not given to plain declarations about people. Darcy could not have told you when she started watching for his light in the basement window when she came home at night. She could not have told you when she started going downstairs to knock on his door on the pretense of asking study questions that she already knew the answers to. She was 16, and she was aware enough to understand she needed to be careful about what she called what she was feeling. And so she called it nothing. On the night she passed her grade 11 provincial exams, not just passed, but placed in the top 15% of the province. Gran made butter tarts and Alistair appeared at the back door, with a gas station bouquet of yellow carnations that he had clearly bought on impulse and looked slightly embarrassed about. Catherine cried. Robert shook Alistair's hand. Darcy took the carnations and felt her face go warm. Later, they sat on the front porch while the rest of the house went to sleep. The June night was cool the way Vancouver June nights always were, the kind of cool that smelled like cut grass and salt air coming in off the inlet. They ate butter tarts and talked about nothing in particular. What she might want to study, what his rotations would look like next year, whether Gran's neighborhood association was ever going to fix the pothole at the end of the block. Darcy had a small brass compass on a keychain that had been her grandfather's. She'd carried it for years without entirely knowing why. She took it off the ring and held it out to him. She said it was for good luck in the labs. He looked at it for a moment and then he put it on his keyring and clipped it back. He said she was going to be remarkable, whatever she chose. He said it the way he said the things he believed, without decoration. She would spend a long time later, trying to remember whether she had said anything back. She didn't think she had. The morning after her 17th birthday, Darcy came downstairs and found a note slipped under her bedroom door. It was written on the back of an envelope in his careful, compressed handwriting. Something's happened at home. I had to leave. I'm sorry I couldn't explain properly. Study hard. If the world is fair, we'll cross paths again. Take care of yourself, kid. She checked the hook by the back door where he always hung his keys. The hook was empty. She went down the exterior stairs to the suite. The door was unlocked. Inside, everything was clean and bare and wrong. He'd taken his books, his bags, the photo of his mother that he kept on the desk. The only thing left on the shelf was his copy of Harrison's Principles of Internal Medicine, a textbook so battered and annotated in the margins that she'd once teased him about using it as a journal. She stood in the empty room for a long time. Gran said he'd paid 3 months ahead and left before 6 in the morning. She'd tried to ask questions, and he'd said only that there was a family emergency and that he was sorry. Darcy put the Harrisons on her own shelf. She told herself it was because the annotations were useful reference material. She kept the spine together with an elastic band when it cracked at the binding. She packed it for nursing school. She carried it for 8 years. She had been at Vancouver General for 6 weeks when Cressida took her for coffee at the Tim Hortons on the main floor and said, "You know the new attending is settling in well." It was said casually, with a small particular smile that Darcy had learned to recognize as meaning the speaker was not being casual at all. Cressida had worked the cardiology unit for 3 years. She was good at her job, precise, fast, politically intelligent in the way that mattered in a hospital. She had been kind to Darcy in her first week in the particular way that senior nurses can be kind to new ones, making introductions, explaining the unit's specific culture, flagging which residents to approach and which to work around. Darcy had been genuinely grateful. She had also gradually noticed the way Cressida tracked Alistair's movements in the unit without seeming to. The way she positioned herself at the station when he was doing rounds. The way she laughed slightly too readily when he said anything that could be construed as humorous. "We overlapped a bit," Cressida said, adding sugar to her coffee. "Before he went abroad for his fellowship, we were friendly." She looked up. "He's very focused. Not really someone who opens up easily." Darcy said that seemed about right. She did not say anything else. Alistair, meanwhile, had begun doing small things that she tried hard not to read into. A protein bar left on her keyboard on a Tuesday morning, when the unit was short-staffed and everyone had skipped lunch. No note just there. 2 patient notes of hers flagged in the chart system with a small star annotation. Well documented. He had done the same for other nurses on those charts. But she knew her notes, and she knew which ones he'd flagged, and they were the 2 she'd spent the longest on. Once passing her station while she was recalculating a dosage that wasn't adding up, he paused without stopping his stride and said, "Split the weight factor out before you run the formula." It was exactly right. It was also said in exactly the tone he'd used at Gran's kitchen table when she was 15 and couldn't see where she was going wrong. She let herself believe it was coincidence, because the alternative required her to act on it, and she didn't know yet what acting on it would mean. The unit's end-of-rotation dinner was held at a restaurant in Gastown, exposed brick and low lighting, and a noise level that made conversation an effort. Darcy drank more than she'd planned to, because the week had been difficult in the way that hospital weeks sometimes were. A patient who didn't make it, a family who'd been grateful and then devastated inside the same hour, the particulars exhaustion that came from caring about strangers' worst days as a professional obligation. She ended up outside on the patio in the October cold, leaning on the railing, watching the water and trying to let the noise settle. Alistair came out a few minutes later. He stood beside her. He didn't say anything immediately, which was very like him. He'd always been comfortable with quiet in a way that Darcy had never quite managed. "Then, you look like you're having a terrible night." She laughed, and it came out sharper than she meant. "I'm great, best possible night." He looked at her for a moment. Just her name, nothing else, Darcy. Something in the shape of it undid her. Not the polite clinical inflection he'd been using for 6 weeks. Something older. Something that recognized her. Her eyes filled before she could stop them. She turned toward the water. She felt his jacket settle around her shoulders, and she did not say anything, because there was nothing she trusted herself to say. She found the compass 10 days later. It was early, before the unit properly woke up, and she was in the break room refilling a chart binder. His bag was on the chair he always used for his pre-rounds charting. He came in before anyone else, which she'd noticed because she also came in before anyone else and had been doing a careful, exhausting job of not factoring that information into anything. The keyring was hanging from the bag's side clip. She saw it from across the room and did not move for a full breath. It was scratched and worn and unmistakably the same. The small brass compass, dull now in a way it hadn't been when she'd given it to him, because it had been somewhere being used for 8 years. She could see the loop of the clip had been repaired at some point. Someone had replaced the ring with a sturdier one. She stood there until she heard footsteps in the corridor. She went straight to his office. She did not knock. She put the keyring on his desk and looked at him and said, "Tell me you don't know what that is." He looked at it, then at her. Something shifted in his face, not dramatically, not the way it happens in films, but in the small particular way of someone who has been holding something for a long time and has been found out. He said, "Darcy." She said, Don't say my name like that, and then look at me like I'm a nurse you met 6 weeks ago. I'm not. You know I'm not." He stood up. He closed the office door. He said, "I know." His mother's stroke had come on without warning, the week after Darcy's birthday. He'd driven through the night from Vancouver to catch a flight to Halifax. Her recovery had taken 2 years, partial, and then better, and then a long plateau. He'd deferred his program, taken a part-time clinical position to pay for her care supplements, and somewhere in the move from Gran's suite to his aunt's spare room in Halifax, he'd lost the small notebook where he'd written Gran Bet's address and telephone number. He'd tried directory listings. Gran had moved. She'd downsized to a smaller place in New Westminster 2 years after he'd left and unlisted her number because she'd been getting too many sales calls. He'd had the compass the entire time. He'd kept it in every coat pocket, every bag, every keyring. He'd told himself it was just a good compass. The fellowship in London had come through unexpectedly in his third year back in his program. He'd accepted it because it was the right thing for his career, and because by then he had convinced himself that Darcy had moved on, built her life, met someone sensible and kind who had been present in all the years he'd been absent. He'd been afraid that appearing would only be disruptive. When the position at Vancouver General came through, his supervisor had sent him the personnel files for the cardiology unit. He'd seen her name, Darcy Okafor, RN. He'd recognized it before he'd even consciously processed it. He'd spent 2 days deciding what to do. He'd been afraid that if he acknowledged who she was, he would have to account for all the years he hadn't. He'd been afraid that would she angry, or worse, that she wouldn't be. That whatever had existed between them would have faded on her side to nothing, while he'd been carrying it across 2 countries and an ocean. "I was going to tell you," he said. "I was trying to find the right moment. I kept running out of nerve." Darcy looked at him. She thought about the Harrisons on her shelf, with the elastic band around the spine. She thought about the 17-year-old who had sat on a porch in June and given a boy her grandfather's compass and not said any of the things she'd meant to say. She thought about 8 years of not quite managing to move on, not quite understanding why. She said, "You carried a compass across 2 countries and couldn't find 2 minutes to say hello." He said, "That's a fair description." She said, "You're an idiot." He said, "That's also fair." She laughed. It came out wobbly at the edges. He handed her a tissue from his desk. She took it. She did not cry entirely, but it was a close thing. The complaint Cressida filed went to Meg, the charge nurse supervisor, who had been working the unit longer than anyone, and who processed the allegation with the particular calm of someone who had seen this specific situation at least twice before. She reviewed the medication filing records. She traced the documentation errors back through the chart system timestamps. She interviewed both of them separately. The errors that had appeared in files near Darcy's name had been introduced before Darcy had touched those files. The complaint had no clinical basis. Meg communicated this in writing and placed Cressida on an administrative review, and Cressida did not return to the unit after that. Darcy ran into her in the corridor near the elevator on Cressida's last day, collecting her locker items. Cressida looked at her for a long moment. She said, "I saw the way he looked at you. From the very first day. He never looked at anyone else on that unit like that." She didn't say it kindly, but she said it the way people say things they have been holding tightly for too long, and it sounded like relief as much as anything else. Darcy thought about that for a while afterward. She didn't feel satisfaction. She felt something closer to sadness, the waste of it, the particular waste of someone turning a good friendship into something small out of fear and wanting. Gran Bet called on Sunday as she always did. Darcy told her about Alistair carefully, the way she'd been telling Gran things since she was small, in the right order, leaving nothing important out. Gran listened without interrupting, which was not her usual approach. When Darcy finished, Gran said, "Oh, that boy, I always hoped." She mentioned something she'd never told Darcy before, that Alistair's mother had sent Christmas cards for 2 years after he'd left. In the second one, she'd included a small note. She'd written that her own father, Alistair's grandfather, had been very ill years before, in Halifax, and that a young surgical resident on outreach from Vancouver had operated on him and saved his life. The family had always spoken of it. She'd never known the doctor's name. Darcy's stepfather Robert had done surgical outreach in Atlantic Canada in the late 80s, before he and Catherine had met. He had worked for 2 years out of a hospital in Halifax. Darcy sat with the phone pressed against her ear and said, "Gran." Gran said, "I know. Did you know this whole time?" "I only guessed. I thought it wasn't mine to say." Darcy thought about 2 families in 2 different parts of the country, connected by a single surgery in a Halifax hospital. Neither of them knowing, both of them going about their lives with the thread between them invisible. She thought about what her grandfather would have said about that. He'd been a man who believed in the interconnectedness of things, which she'd always assumed was just something old people believed to make themselves feel better. She was no longer entirely sure he'd been wrong. It was a Tuesday evening in late October, the maple trees along the seawall at their most furiously orange. Alistair had asked if she wanted to walk. Not dinner, not a date, just a walk, he'd said, and she'd understood that he was still figuring out how to be in the same space as her without the 6 weeks of careful professional distance between them. She brought Gran's old thermos filled with tea because it was cold, and she knew he never dressed warmly enough. They walked for a long time without saying very much. This had always been possible with him, the comfortable quiet. She had forgotten how much she'd missed it. They ended up on the seawall near the hospital, the water dark and cold beside them, the city lights reflecting. She thought about standing here 6 weeks ago in his jacket. She thought about standing on Grant's porch, 11 years ago, with a gas station bouquet of yellow carnations on the step. He stopped. He said, "I have something." He reached into his coat pocket and held out the compass keyring. She looked at it. There was a ring looped onto the chain. Simple, white gold, unpretentious, the kind of ring that someone chose because they knew the person they were giving it to and not because they wanted to impress anyone. He looked at her. "I was supposed to give this back to you a long time ago," he said. "I'm trying to be on time for the parts that matter." She looked at the ring. She looked at him. She thought about 8 years of an elastic band, holding a textbook spine together. She thought about a compass that had crossed 2 countries and come back. She held out her hand. He slipped the ring onto her finger. She closed her hand around the compass and felt the worn brass warm in her palm. She had spent 8 years believing that waiting was the same as wasting. She understood now that she'd had it wrong. Some things don't come when you want them. They come when they're real enough to bear the weight of what they need to carry. And sometimes they find their way back to you along a thread so old and thin, you never even knew it was there. Running all the way back to a surgery in Halifax, to a porch in June, to a brass compass on a keyring that 2 people had been holding on to, each from their own side, waiting for the moment when the distance between them finally closed.